we have to really escalate the noise we make so that we'll be heard.
Welcome to Gay USA. I'm Andy Hum.
And you're echoing.
And I hear an echo in here. Is there something wrong with that?
Maybe. Nah, they fixed it. I'm Ann Northrup, and this is Gay USA.
Okay. Well, of course, the big news this week was that New Jersey college student Darun Ravi...
Is he still a college student?
Well, that's how old he is anyway. Is guilty on 15 counts for invading the privacy of Tyler Clementi as a hate crime and covering up the evidence that he did it. We will be joined in our discussion by Bill Dobbs, a gay civil libertarian.
Who attended the trial of
Right.
Darun Ravi, so we'll get some firsthand knowledge of that. And the question of the week, has the virulently anti-gay National Organization for Marriage reversed course by saying it's backing civil unions over marriage in New Hampshire? I think we know the answer to that question, but we'll go over the details.
President Obama, the likely Democratic nominee for president, has come out against the anti-gay marriage amendment in North Carolina that is set for a vote on May the 8th. Michelle Obama spoke out for a Supreme Court that will support who you love. Whomever you love.
And as she sometimes says, whomever we love.
Yes, that's the actual quote.
Okay. Well, she used both. And you may remember Rick Santorum. Is he the likely Republican candidate? Well, he had a busy week coming out against pornography, promoting the reinstitution of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and cheering for an anti-gay preacher in Louisiana whose fire and brimstone we will show to you.
Yeah. That Tennessee bill we told you about, which would ban discussion of homosexuality in schools, looks to be dead, but you won't be encouraged about the reason why.
The president of Liberia, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, was asked about laws on homosexuality this week, with Tony Blair sitting next to her, refusing to take a stand. Andy and I have some different interpretations of this.
But we turn to the topic of the week, which is...
the Darun Ravi trial.
Right.
Now, we want to introduce this by showing you...
Well, first, let's have... This is Bill Dobbs, who is sitting here with us.
Hi, Bill.
Nice to be here.
But we're going to start with a little summation of some of the issues that CBS Sunday Morning did this last weekend. We thought it was a good, valuable piece. So we're going to take 3 minutes of that and show you that before we start talking about it.
This is Erin Moriarty.
The swastikas, there are about 15 or 16 of them.
They think somebody wrote KKK.
It was once so black and white. Swastikas spray painted on walls.
And destroying America!
Crosses burned on lawns. When civil rights workers were killed in the 1960s, it was called a hate crime. Whether it was the dragging death of James Byrd by 3 white supremacists in 1998,
It is a story of a vicious crime of hate.
or the brutal torture that same year of 21-year-old Matthew Shepard because he was gay.
It was a brutal attack on migrant farm workers.
Most of the nearly 10,000 hate crimes documented every year involve violence or a threat of violence.
On count 8, the bias intimidation, we find
Until this.
because of sexual orientation, guilty or not guilty.
Guilty.
20-year-old Darun Ravi has become the latest to be convicted of bias intimidation or hate crimes. In his case, targeting his gay college roommate, Tyler Clementi. What makes this case so unusual is that the weapon was a camera on Ravi's computer. In September of 2010, Ravi used his webcam to twice spy on his roommate when Clementi brought another man into their shared dorm room for a sexual encounter. Ravi later tweeted his friends about what he had done. I saw him making out with a dude. And later even invited his friends to watch. People are having a viewing party with a bottle of Bacardi and beer.
Or not guilty.
Guilty.
Ravi's actions might never have become public except for what happened next. Tyler Clemente committed suicide by jumping off the George Washington Bridge. But Daroon Ravi didn't know for sure what his roommate had done when police interrogated him a day later.
Is it safe to say you invaded his privacy?
Well, yes, but...
Okay. Let's really do it. Yes or no, it ain't a but. Either you did or you didn't.
I mean, I didn't realize it was like something so private.
Exactly.
It was my room also.
The case sparked international outrage, and Ravi was charged with 15 counts of invasion of privacy, bias intimidation, and witness tampering.
On count 15, tampering with physical evidence, we find...
But Friday, when the jury found him guilty of all of them, some, like Seton Hall University law professor Mark Poyer, thought the verdict was an overreaction.
I was really very sad. I don't think any good will come of this.
What do you mean?
Well, Ravi's life is going to be ruined. I don't see how the judge can avoid giving him jail time. And I think that the breadth with which the hate crime law was applied will open it up for a lot of prosecutorial discretion and for a lot of groups across the spectrum to claim that they've been victims.
Now, there are a lot of threads to this case. He was convicted of invasion of privacy. He was convicted of intimidation not because he meant to intimidate him, but because the jury decided that Tyler Clemente felt intimidated. And he was convicted of tampering with evidence, which I think is fairly serious. There is a question about, as was said in the piece, would any of this conviction or trial or prosecution or anything have happened if Tyler Clemente had not committed suicide?
Which was not supposed to be relevant to the case.
Not a part of the case. He was not charged with any connection with the suicide. And then you could bring race into it, too. If Daroon Ravi were white, would he have been prosecuted? And he also turned down a plea deal that is perceived as having been, no jail time, no potential deportation back to India, which he was taken from when he was about 2, and just some community service, but a conviction on his record.
So a lot of things. And maybe if you could start, since you were there at the trial, by saying, were you surprised by the verdict?
I was. There were so many counts. There were 15 charges, but 35 counts. It took quite a while to read through all the findings that the jury had made. And I think it's helpful to go back to the beginning because the initial reports had a lot of inaccurate information, that there had been a recording, that it had been broadcast, that it involved sex, and that suicide was caused by those events.
Right.
And it sounded so compelling that the public quickly got outraged, and quickly Ravi and his friend, Molly Way, were indicted for invasion of privacy. Felony charges in New Jersey.
Let me just ask,
Yep.
and we know that that's not what happened, but what was Tyler Clemente's perception of what happened is partly what's at play here. I mean, did he think that his sex life was being broadcast to the school?
Whatever Tyler may or may not have felt, the initial indictment of 2 felony counts against Way and Ravi 6 months later, because of a lot of pressure by gay advocacy groups, frankly, resulted in a very long indictment, this 35-count, 15-charge indictment. And suddenly, an episode got magnified, and whatever efforts the prosecutor, the defense attorney, the judge made to keep the suicide out of the courtroom, because there was no charges related to the suicide. There is nothing but a riddle that remains about the suicide, but nonetheless, the suicide cast an extremely long shadow that was always in that courtroom. My opinion, if Clemente was alive, this likely would have not been a matter for the criminal justice system at all. It would have been worked out on campus. There might have been there might have been some discipline. But the point you raise, Andy, is about the technical details of these hate crime statutes. Mostly lawyers understand them. What we, the public, usually know about them is there are these things called hate crimes, and we need special laws to deal with them. What is not very well known is the way that those laws work. And frankly, as these prosecutions mount, the problems with them are becoming more obvious.
Well, isn't this case, in fact, a sort of watershed in applying hate crimes laws and thereby escalating potential punishment in a case where there was no physical violence?
This whole undertaking was a way to throw the book, a long list of charges, at Ravi because of public outrage and pressure on the prosecutor.
So tell us about the atmosphere at the trial, because you were there, and that's what we don't know.
And just before you do that, you're kind of the only gay activist down there, basically. I mean, this was not a case for all the uproar in the community over the case where people were sent down to observe the trial. You went down.
Mostly the courtroom was filled with a lot of reporters and media people. And family members and relatives of Ravi and also the Clementis. The atmosphere, mostly what we learned about the trial was what went on within the four walls of that courtroom. There was very little, there was nobody writing about this trial, asking questions about, larger questions about justice. Is this the way to grapple with this episode? And what about bullying? There's another whole section of this issue, which is there's something else possibly going on. How Rutgers University reacted, what kind of campus climate there was. But most of the focus was we've got to get who's ever responsible for this, and let's not worry about due process and compromising their rights. So from the get-go, Ravi and Wei were seen as demons, and that's what the jury did, in effect, is they said, we don't, I believe that, you put all these charges before them, and they said, well, we think this is a bad guy, therefore we're throwing the book at him too.
Well, are you, look, I think this trial was a huge mistake. I think all these charges are, for the most part, nonsense. I think it should have been campus discipline. But are you suggesting that, given that this trial was brought and these charges were made, that it was not a fair trial in that context?
What it raises for me is the ethics of organizing when something bad happens, which is it's possible. Well, let me go back in time, which is for decades, if one of us was injured or maimed or even killed, quite possibly the justice system, the criminal justice system, wouldn't pay attention. Police might not take a report, there might be a shoddy investigation, a prosecutor might not bring reasonable charges, and the jury might let them off.
Still happens on a daily basis.
And of course, what's happening in Iraq right now.
Sometimes, yes. Sometimes that may happen now, but what is also possible, especially with high-profile cases like Brandon Tina's case or Matthew Shepard's case and others, is that there is now a lot more sensitivity to LGBT crime victims. And it's possible to organize in such a way, if you don't pay attention to where that pressure is going and how much to bring and what the goal is, it can destroy people on the receiving end of that. In the Matthew Shepard case, I and a handful of us opposed the death penalty for Shepard's killers, and people said, quite reasonably, why are you trying to save Matthew Shepard's killers? To which I could point to Stanley Lingar's case in Missouri, Calvin Burdine's case in Texas, people who did terrible things, but nonetheless, bias against them may have cost them a death sentence. So we can't just look at the criminal justice system from the point of view of victims. We also need to look at how it deals with us as individuals, no matter which side of it we're on.
I think there was more than a handful that were against the death penalty in that case or any case in the community. And I think there was some lobbying that we all, I was just going to say, there was some lobbying that we did to make groups come out against the death penalty as well.
Right.
So talk a little about hate crimes laws in general a little more and why we should be suspicious of them.
We got a lot of laws on the books to punish just about any injury to a person, and we've graduated them. Things we think are worse, like killing somebody, generally get more punishment. And the way that these things are calibrated is based on the intent. Intent sounds similar to motive, but it isn't. With hate crime law, we get to bring motive into a case, and it's a little complicated to describe the way this works because, again, lawyers are sensitive to this stuff, and we haven't really learned it as a public. What happens is victims suddenly become more important than other people, some victims. If someone breaks my jaw and says some magic bad words, suddenly my jaw might become more important than another person's jaw for whom those magic words were not heard. So the idea of equality before the law is smashed. That's on the victim side. On the defendant side, you get to bring into the courtroom, the prosecutor has a new weapon, which is who a person is, what their beliefs are, what they're thinking and why, which is much different than the intent. So we're not just prosecuting for misdeeds, we're prosecuting for who somebody is and what their character is.
Part of look, I lobbied for hate crimes laws in the old days. I have many misgivings about the way they're being implemented now. But at the time, it was about things like, and you could explain it with like the swastika written on the church or on the side of the supermarket, had a qualitative difference from just graffiti putting your name up on the side of the building. They're the same physical act, but the other one was meant to intimidate the community. Hate crimes were things like, let's just wait for the first black person to come down the street and whack him because of that, which terrorizes the community. That was the genesis of these laws. It was a crime against the community and not against just an individual.
Well, then how to explain in Boston there are presently 3 lesbians who are being charged for attacking a gay man, and they face hate crime charges.
I think it's possible for lesbians to have hate against gay men.
It is possible, but some of this stuff is really straining our sense of what a hate crime is.
Well, I have very mixed feelings also about hate crimes laws, but the case you cite, if lesbians start beating up a gay man and calling him a faggot while they're doing it in tones that are clearly an expression of hate against a community, then I see no reason why that wouldn't fit under the hate crimes laws as much as anything else.
If somebody breaks my ribs, I have a good idea they don't like me.
I think you're not answering the question about an attack on the community as a whole.
Well, that's an interesting and a powerful argument. And one thing to remember about crime is that it touches very deep nerves. It's easy to get people upset about crime and the fear of being a victim of crime. I noticed that years ago in my building, someone was mugged in the vestibule. Suddenly everyone in the building was on edge for the next month. And then I thought, well, this wasn't a hate crime, it was a robbery. It was targeting somebody who may have had some, $50 in their wallet or whatever it was. That the nature of crime is not much different from hate crime. In other words, some of these things, like, yes, a swastika might upset people more than the vandalism, but then you get to use that same kind of law against people who years ago spray painted something in front of St. Patrick's Cathedral.
Right. Now let's go back. Let's go back to this case and what new ground it breaks in terms of this. This idea that if people perceive, if the person you did it to perceives it, even though you didn't intend it or anything in terms of hatred, and there was no proof really that Ravi hated gay people. There was some mild anti-gay things, remarks, that kind of stuff. He was not a vicious anti-gay bigot. This thing about
more ignorance than hatred.
Right. This thing about perception, seems to lead to, as somebody said, a paranoid schizophrenic feels that way all the time, that people are out to get him, and could start charging people with hate crimes. Well, what new ground do you think?
Even paranoids are sometimes being followed.
Right. What new ground has this broken that you worry about?
I think what it's broken is that the justice system can be pushed around, and that it can be pushed around in such a way that we don't get justice, we get vengeance. That this result Now, the sentencing in a couple of months.
Probably facing 5 years. Could face up to 10, but the experts are saying 5 probably.
Well, but there's a potential for 10 years there. And one of the fascinating things about this case now is that it has really caused a lot of head scratching about what happened, what about cyberbullying, what about how the justice system reacted, what about our own community organizing in this. And what I'm seeing now is that there are numbers of gay and lesbian voices who are skeptical of this verdict and the way that this prosecution was handled.
He will be sentenced on May 21st, or that's the current schedule, and different predictions. What do you... I'd love to see him get community service instead of any jail time.
Well, there was so many convicted charges, though.
One of the fascinating aspects of this case is why didn't he take a plea deal?
Because he didn't think he was guilty, and he couldn't believe he'd be convicted.
I think that's part of it.
And he would have a felony charge for the rest of his life.
Well, right. For a 20-year-old to plead guilty to a felony, there's actually a lot of consequences to being a convicted felon. And you know, both Ravi and Clemente were members of minorities. Clemente because he was gay, and that was a vulnerable spot for him. He was just coming out. Ravi, Indian American, but only with a green card. And that fact may have cost him something here, because the amount of pressure the prosecutor put on and all the charges meant that if they were to settle it, he seemed to want a felony conviction, him to plead guilty to a felony, very serious consequences. So he had to balance possibly going out of the country, getting kicked out of the country, and a felony conviction, and losing his being a student at Rutgers, versus the second time the prosecutor made an offer, there was no jail involved.
Right.
I have to wonder if that wasn't a signal that their case was really weak. But once you get inside a courtroom and there's a jury, there's great jeopardy.
Well, we'll see what happens on appeal, too. I was fascinated by his interrogation where he said it was my room, too. Yeah. I didn't think of it as such an invasion of privacy.
And he tried to make a thing that I was also concerned about, the stuff in my room. I don't know if that was true. I think he was playing a very vicious prank.
I think he was playing an innocent prank, but that's
innocent?
Me. Yes.
How would you feel if your sexual acts were broadcast to the world?
I wouldn't be bringing a sexual partner into a shared dorm room.
Well, but you know.
But that's a whole other... By the way, you saw MB, the sexual partner at the trial. Any impressions?
This is the 32-year-old.
Observation?
Now 32
well,
that he,
you know, I also want to add, there
dating.
is an interesting way that race swirls here, because Ravi, you know, on one side of the courtroom, there were a lot of Indians, and on the other side of the courtroom, a lot of white folks. Shortly after this episode burst into public view, I noticed on message boards quite ugly racist and xenophobic sentiments about Ravi and Wei. So for all the, you know, high-tone, almost self-righteous talk about homophobia was used over and over and over in that courtroom as a term and, you know, concept. There was never anything about race, and it makes me conscious of how quickly the social fabric can fray, because everyone wanted them off campus. Campus Pride even said, expel them immediately, no need to worry about a trial. But as to MB, you know, this all begs questions. Tyler Clemente grew up in a house where he couldn't be open about who he was.
True, of almost
he had an
all
older
of us.
gay brother.
Well, this is a recent development, but his church, his school, his family.
He had a terrible church.
He got dropped into a straight household, straight school, and straight thinking
gay
church.
reparative therapy church.
Right. So we need to be asking questions about that. The internet proved to be a really interesting life preserver for him, because he built a virtual world from a fairly young age. But what was helping to pull him ashore and ensure that he had real people who were going to support him, because this was something of a crisis. MB, you know, I sat there thinking, some of this is protecting him because he's a crime victim, but another part of it makes me wonder that we still have a world where someone at 32 years of age is really, really, really concerned that people not know that he's gay. This in a state with extensive legislation to protect his identity.
It's also a case of a lot of notoriety that would come to him that would make his life difficult.
I can understand.
Yeah, but think about the sexual shame and all that. Like what?
I'm just talking about being a notorious figure in general.
We don't know if he's married.
Problem.
You know, there may be many reasons for him to want to maintain his privacy, but we don't usually accord that level of privacy to people who have to testify in trials.
Right.
On the other hand, trials don't always have this level of notoriety.
Well,
all right. Well, I don't know that we've answered anything, but it's always fascinating to talk to you,
and we
Bill.
appreciate you going down there and observing.
I think it's healthy to look carefully at this case because it raises a lot of questions about the ethics of how organizing is done when something really bad happens.
And how quickly we
rush to judgment. And I think it's important to ask ourselves questions. When something bad happens, how bad is it? And what do we want done about it? And sometimes that last question, you almost need to answer it in years in prison, because we've gotten to a point where we think it's fine to throw lives away and sentence people to such long terms that there's no hope of change or redemption or reformation. That's a mistake.
And important in this case in particular to remember that we do not know the reasons for Tyler Clementi's suicide. He and Daroon Ravi was not charged with any connection with the suicide, and the people who make that leap and want to blame him for it are making a mistake.
Right, but that shadow was always in the courtroom, and it was a very painful thing to deal with. This is a horrible episode.
Okay, we will move on to other news, but thank you, Bill, for coming in, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.
Okay.
Yep. Well, aside from the Daroon Ravi trial, the big news of the week, as always these days, is presidential politics. And I think we're particularly appalled as Rick Santorum goes farther and farther to the right. He was at a rally at an Illinois gym this week. We're taping before the results of the Illinois primary, and two men got up and started kissing. They called attention to themselves. The crowd started yelling, chanting USA, USA, and they got thrown out of the rally for Santorum. But that may not have been the worst example of what happened.
The worst is probably him being at a rally with Reverend Dennis Terry, who was, I believe, the pastor of Tony Perkins.
Yes,
from the
Tony was there too.
Family Research Council at the Greenswell Springs Baptist Church, or he's the pastor of that, in Louisiana on Sunday. And this guy was talking about how this is a Christian nation, we don't worship Buddha, we don't worship
Allah,
all those guys. We're not allowed to mention their names. But he also went on, and Santorum is sitting the whole time clapping and nodding his head and praise the Lord. And listen to what this pastor, Dennis Terry, had to say about a couple of social issues.
Listen closely. Now hold on for just a moment. As long as they continue to kill little babies in our mother's womb, somebody's got to take a stand and say, it's not right. God be merciful to us as a nation. As long as sexual perversion is becoming normalized, somebody needs to stand up and say, God forgive us, God have mercy upon us. As long as they continue to tell our children they cannot pray in public schools or pray in open public places today, somebody's got to take a stand and say, God forgive us, God have mercy upon us. As long as they continue to tear down traditional marriage. Listen, God intended for marriage to be between a man and a woman. And as long as they continue to attack marriage, somebody needs to take a stand and say, no, 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 no.
Sounds like Fred Phelps.
Well, this could be the next president of the United States, folks. So watch out.
Well, he's trying to have it both ways, though. The news media were rightfully appalled by this and questioned him directly about it. At least they're getting hip enough to ask the questions. And he said, "Oh, you know, America's for everybody, and I'm not trying to kick out non-Christians."
When somebody starts talking like that, you need to leave. I left this show once when someone was making some terrible remarks that I thought were borderline racist.
Really?
Well, it was a variation of one of Lou's shows that he did. It's a long story. I'll tell you later. But some people didn't talk to me for a long time after that. But that's what you have to do. You have to get out of the hall sometimes. Okay. Santorum also promised to reinstate Don't Ask, Don't Tell again, which he's already said. And he wants to completely stop pornography. You know,
good luck with that.
Well, I'm saying if all of you out there who have ever looked at pornography promise not to vote Republican this year, I think we can pull this election
I'd like to think no one who's watching this show is silly enough to consider voting for Rick Santorum, but I shouldn't make assumptions. Meanwhile, our pal Republican out-gay presidential candidate Fred Karger beat Ron Paul in the Puerto Rican primary. Ron Paul had 1.22% of the votes, and Fred had 1.43% of the votes.
Now, you think things aren't getting any better? We even have an out-gay candidate for the legislature out in North Dakota. His name is Joshua Bashi. He's been an editor of a gay paper out there and things like that. He says, I just happen to be gay now. Well, you're a gay activist. Come on. And he's running out there. In fact, his column was called The Gay Agenda.
And the New York Times Sunday Magazine did one of their little full-page interviews with Tammy Baldwin running for Senate in Wisconsin. She, deflects lesbian questions to I'm here for the people of Wisconsin and the economy, but she's very out and very good and terrific.
And we've got an out-gay, the first out-gay federal judge outside New York. Michael Fitzgerald approved on a 91-6 vote. They finally let some of those go through there in the Senate.
He's going to be on the U.S. District Court of Central California. And our president, unlike Rick Santorum, has been doing some pro-gay things. First of all, the state dinner for David Cameron last week, tons of gay people there, some with their same-sex husbands, wives,
some with their beards, like Ed Koch.
Some with opposite-sex guests. But sitting at the head table with Obama and David Cameron was the new head of HRC, Chad Griffin, and his partner, Jerome Fallon.
And the gay philanthropist Tim Gill was at the dinner, and he comes up on the receiving line to Cameron, and he goes, you think we can get this guy on board on same-sex marriage?
Pointing to Obama.
Who's standing right there, and Cameron says, we were just talking about that. So I don't know what they were talking about, but the president is evolving on the issue.
Well, he put out a statement last week about the proposed constitutional amendment in North Carolina, which is an anti-same-sex marriage constitutional amendment, and people have been wanting him to speak out. He spoke out against Prop 8 in California when that was
He's
up
against
for a vote.
all these amendments.
So he is against the North Carolina amendment, which is good news. This is the one that's going to be voted on May 8th. The California Democratic State Party also announced that they want to get involved in North Carolina and help defeat it.
It's like foreign aid. California is going to help North Carolina.
Well, that would be nice. And, Ted Olson is headed there on April 1st.
I'm headed to hear Ted Olson tonight.
Walls. But this week, after we tape, but before you see the show probably, New Hampshire is scheduled to vote on the latest proposal to repeal same-sex marriage rights in New Hampshire. Now, there are strange things happening there. The proposal keeps changing. Will it reinstitute civil unions, or will maybe they drop that and just call for a non-binding public referendum on the question? The National Organization for Marriage is speaking up and saying, yeah, we should vote for the civil unions proposal, which is really just a smokescreen for them to get rid of marriage. They don't really support civil unions.
Right. But John Lynch, the governor, is going to veto whatever they do. But the question is, can they override his veto?
Well,
and that is up in the air.
But here's the new question. Will they just go for the referendum vote at the moment so that they can wait till next year when presumably they can replace Lynch, who will be out of office then, with someone who will not veto a marriage repeal?
Maybe we can replace them.
Exactly.
We need to replace that legislature up in New Hampshire. Folks, you've got to pay attention to who's in your state legislatures. That's where a lot of bad stuff is happening these days.
And Michelle Obama is pointing out that you need to pay attention to who's on the Supreme Court of the United States. She is making a lot of campaign appearances these days, and one thing she is talking about is the need to keep President Obama in office because we need a Supreme Court that can
So succeeding generations can love whomever they choose, is her line.
Yeah. Nice that we're a positive message in the campaign. We're so used to be the scapegoat.
Well, and of course, the big question, at least that we were reading about online this week, is what are the odds that the president is going to issue this executive order covering contractors' non-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity? And people think it's a toss-up of whether the campaign will do that.
I'm not optimistic.
Okay.
Because I think that's taking a chance they don't want to take.
I thought it was going to be our gay pride present this year.
This could be our bet for the year.
Okay, let's make that the bet.
Okay.
I say it'll be our gay pride present.
And I say it will not happen before the election.
Okay. $5?
Sure.
We're not allowed to raise money on the show, but from each other, it's okay.
By the way, our former president, Jimmy Carter, has a new book coming out in which he describes his evolution to supporting same-sex civil marriage. Of course, he's one of these people who says, I don't think it should be mandated for churches to perform same-sex marriage.
But he acts like his church does support it, even though he's a Baptist.
Exactly. He also says homosexuality was well known in the ancient world long before
and Jesus
the birth
said nothing
of
about
Jesus.
it. And Jesus said nothing about it, which is true if you read your Bible out there.
Before or after he was born.
Right.
Focus on the Family, however, is not taking a back seat. They are active now in Colorado, pushing for a vote on a constitutional amendment to allow all people and organizations to discriminate any way they want to.
Boy, oh boy.
We should have asked Bill Dobbs how he feels about non-discrimination laws.
Well, I mean, our people in Washington are pushing for a U.S. Senate hearing, at least, on the Employment Non-Discrimination Act in the United States Senate. You know,
sad, since we came within one vote of passing it
in 1996. And of course, there's a growing movement out there, a grassroots movement, saying we shouldn't just be going for employment non-discrimination. We should be going for an amendment to the Civil Rights Act that covers housing, public accommodations, and employment.
The New Hampshire House, as it's getting ready to vote on marriage repeal, meanwhile rejected by a 3-to-1 margin, letting people refuse to perform weddings or provide services because of religious objections. This bill would have done what Focus on the Family wants Colorado to do, which is legalize all potential discrimination. Now, there are people like Ron Paul who think non-discrimination laws are invalid and should not happen.
Libertarians do not support those kinds of adding categories and saying you can't discriminate on that basis. Their philosophy is if a restaurant discriminates against African Americans, for instance, and you don't like that, don't go to the restaurant. That is their that is the libertarian view.
Rule, yes.
Right. I, of course, have worked for civil rights laws all my life. Yeah. Well, not when I was 2. Anyway, the repeal of the Defense of Marriage Act, that bill, a lot more sponsors this year. There are now 140 in the House and 31 in the Senate, which is up from 108 and 18 last year.
New Orleans proclaimed Saturday, was it Saturday? Yes, LGBT Civil Rights Equality Awareness Day because it was Bayard Rustin's 100th birthday, and you have been celebrating Bayard Rustin's birthday.
Right, great civil rights leader, was pretty much always openly gay, and then finally got really into gay rights work at the very end of his life. He died in 1987, but did a valuable service. on that, among many other things.
One reason they did that was because they were prompted to by this guy, Richard Noble, who's doing a walk across America for LGBT civil rights. We haven't given him much notice on this show, but he is on a relentless march. We also haven't always noted some of the local demonstrations against the Human Rights Campaign and their dinners that are taking place these days. There was one in New York a few weeks ago, and HRC held another big dinner in L.A. last week, and there were demonstrators outside there upset about them giving awards.
Using Blankfein, the head of Goldman Sachs, as their spokesperson on equality these days, their corporate equality.
So there were Get Equal demonstrators who joined with some people from Occupy Wall Street, L.A., and we have a little local report on that.
Now, Lloyd Blankfein might have thought he'd get heat supporting gay marriage from people who are against it. He probably didn't expect to get heat from those who are for it. Blankfein released this PSA for the Human Rights Campaign after being named the group's first national corporate spokesman. The HRC also honored Goldman Sachs for its commitment to the cause. Well, in the Only NLA file, that has not gone over well with some.
HRC dumped Goldman Sachs! HRC dumped Goldman Sachs!
This weekend at HRC's annual fundraiser here, a splinter group from the Occupy movement called the Occupy Los Angeles Queer Affinity Group protested wearing hazmat suits and claiming HRC is toxic and that teaming up with Goldman was, quote, not the kind of marriage we're looking for. Well, it appears Blankfein and Goldman are pawns in a feud between the two gay marriage rights groups as the occupiers accuse HRC of being too cozy with the 1%.
Goldman Sachs, pawns in a feud. Man, that was from a business channel.
They're a little more upset about their guy who left last week and wrote the op-ed piece in the
Absolutely.
Times.
Now, March 17th, which was Bayard Rustin's 100th birthday, was also St. Patrick's Day, celebrated in the usual way in New York with a bigoted parade that keeps gays out. But I covered the demonstration. Now, there is a picture of a kid, the guy with the tie there on the right, Andy, in the middle, Andy Reeves. He was 21 years old. I said, and he's one of these kids who came along and just picked up one of the protest signs because he was offended by what was happening. I said, why are you doing this? He says, well, I think what they're doing against the gays is hate, and I don't like that. I said, well, why did you come to the parade? He didn't know that it was an anti-gay parade. He said, well, you know, I'm leaving for the Marines tomorrow. I said, why'd you join the Marines? He says, to fight for my country. He said, because we need to defend our freedoms. And this was his idea of freedom, which was gays being able to march in the St. Patrick's Day parade. I was very moved by that.
Yeah. Very moving. I'm also happy, although you may have a different take on this, with the Tennessee legislature deciding not to follow through on their proposed Don't Say Gay bill, which was supposed to control the curriculum for kindergarten through 8th grade sex ed. They didn't want homosexuality mentioned. Then they figured out
that heterosexuality would be allowed to be talked about, and it's not. They don't do sex education in the younger grades. This would kind of almost enable it, and they said, oh, wait a minute, we don't want this. And it would have loosened restrictions on that.
But they're now going to go ahead with a push for an abstinence-only education bill.
It is awful anyway.
There's also a move in Tennessee to repeal the law that they passed recently that outlawed non-discrimination laws. And I think that's quite astonishing that I don't know whether they'll succeed in repealing that bill, but they're trying.
We got some good news from Folly Beach in South Carolina. They unanimously voted to pass an ordinance to prevent discrimination in public accommodations on a whole variety of bases, and they did everything at once. They didn't have a human rights law. It also includes sexual orientation.
Not such good news from Indiana, where they have revoked the license plate policy that raised money for an LGBT youth group. They also took it away from a couple of other groups at the same time. They said, well, the rules were violated because they were giving out low license plate numbers, and that's a violation, except that they've always allowed groups to give out low license plate numbers in this program.
If other groups have to suffer in order to prevent the threat of homosexuality
on license plates.
They've been doing that for a long time.
And then they fired the PR guy for the state who announced that they had taken away the license plate
because he
program.
acknowledged that we've fudged this for years. What are you doing it now for?
So he's out too.
All right. Tampa City Council down there in Florida has passed unanimously a move toward creation of a domestic partner registry. It doesn't give domestic partner benefits to city employees or anything. It's like what they did in New York in 1991, basically, when they set up a registry. But it's an important tool and a big step for Tampa.
Some sad stories of violence around the nation. In Minneapolis, an African-American transgender woman and her friends were attacked. One was stabbed, and in the scuffle that ensued, one of the attackers was killed. So this transgender woman, Cece McDonald, has been charged with second-degree murder. Now, there was an earlier case of a killing in self-defense with a gun at the same spot, no charges filed.
Sure.
Definitely a case of unequal prosecution.
A spate of anti-gay LGBT violence in the city of Washington. One man was shot in a Columbia Heights restaurant on March 11th, a gay man, and another gay man and a transgender woman badly beaten on the street the following day in separate incidents. There's been some outpouring of concern out there.
Yeah, and in Dallas, 2 men were fag-bashed, beaten with bats by 5 guys who came upon them in a car. They were just driving by. They gratuitously yell at these guys, get out of the car, and beat them up with baseball bats.
So we've got to stop this violence, and we're passing a lot of anti-bullying laws to also try to educate kids and be more sensitive and things like that. And we did this in New York 2 years ago, and the law was supposed to go into effect soon. Now we have learned that they're going to interpret the law up there. This is the State Board of Regents, not to include charter schools.
And the
bullying law, that they will not have to report, that they will not be bound by the provisions of this law. Charter schools.
The whole point, as we see these stories, is to change the culture at an early age. Right. And if you're not going to institute things like no bullying in schools, how are you going to change this culture?
Yes. And the Christians know about this, because the right wing, because they're trying to infiltrate the schools to influence grade school kids and middle school kids to come to Jesus. And they're using the law to try to get in there to schools to do that.
Absolutely, relentlessly. All right, international news?
Yeah, let's move on to that.
Well, this actually brings up my favorite story of the week, which is that the Gay Uganda group, SMUG, Sexual Minorities of Uganda.
An unfortunate acronym.
I like it. Well, whatever. They have been, obviously...
These are the bravest people in the world on gay rights, if you're doing gay rights work in Uganda.
Because
we've met them, we've had them on the show.
Absolutely.
We support them, and David Kato got killed there, the leader of the movement.
He was killed. They have been under hideous attack ever since the U.S. right-wing evangelists went over to Uganda, because they're failing in this country, to try to start a worldwide movement of condemning homosexuality and, in fact, criminalizing it and pushing this Kill the Gays bill, which we've talked about ad nauseum on this show.
Mass equality.
Well, one of the biggest speakers in favor of persecuting gay people in Uganda is this guy, Scott Lively, who is a well-known preacher and who lives in Springfield, Mass. But there is an international law called the Alien Tort Statute that lets foreigners sue U.S. citizens for violating international law and for causing them harm. And so SMUG has gotten together with the Center for Constitutional Rights here in the United States, and they are suing Scott Lively for creating this persecution of them in Uganda.
I wonder what Bill Dobbs thinks about this.
I think it's great. They're claiming they have been deprived of rights. Scott Lively is the guy who wrote the books Pink Swastika, claiming the Holocaust and Nazism was all about gay Nazis.
Commentary Magazine blamed all of World War II on gay Nazis.
He also says gay people are responsible for the Rwanda genocide, and that and he went over to Uganda and told them them that gay people were coming to recruit their kids through molestation.
Which gave them the idea of putting this law in the books to kill the gays.
Which he now says, I had nothing to do with that. But he is now going to have to defend himself in international court for this.
We can only hope.
Or a U.S. court for violating international law.
Last month we told you about the president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was a recent Nobel Peace Prize winner, who said that she's not going to go along with any of these enhancements for penalties for gays. It's bad enough we've got a criminalization of it. But when she was asked by a reporter from The Guardian, well, what about the criminalization of gay sex acts in general, she would not address this. She wouldn't talk about it. And she got Tony Blair sitting right next to her during this interview. And he's asked, well, what do you think? And he goes, I'm not going to talk about that.
Look, I would like both of them to have been more overt, but the questions really were about the proposals for the enhanced penalties. That's what it started out as. And she said, I'm not signing any laws in this area. And then the Guardian reporter kept pressing her. And she said, we have traditional values and we're just not going to change anything.
Same thing George Bush said in 2000 about sodomy laws.
She is the president of Liberia. There's this huge African backlash against Hillary Clinton's speech. She has said repeatedly, I'm not signing these more draconian laws. I am standing firm against this.
She is better than most. And I doubt any African leader could stay in power if they stood up and said, well, other than in South Africa where it's against the Constitution to discriminate against gays.
Yeah, we know how well that's working out.
Right. But I'm talking about Tony Blair sitting there silently.
He should have said something.
And in speaking of Britain, where he was the prime minister, they finally came out with their consultation on equal civil marriage, but once again, it's not going to allow for straights to get civil partnerships or for anybody, any church, to do a ceremony for gays.
You can be married in a church as long as there is no religious content in the ceremony.
It's very strange.
And this only applies to England and Wales because Scotland is going through a separate process and Northern Ireland wants nothing to do with this.
Correct.
But meanwhile, Ben & Jerry's has come out with a new ice cream flavor called Happily Ever After.
There it is.
To honor
with an
Britain.
Androgynous couple, but probably both of the same gender, probably, on the package. Maybe we can. Sounds like a nice flavor.
Switzerland is moving towards legalizing adoption by same-sex couples, which is good news. Montenegro which is in Eastern Europe, next to Kosovo, financing sex reassignment therapy.
Under their universal health care system.
And
I'd just settle for a universal health care system that covers everything.
They're also hosting a conference called Together Against Discrimination for all the Balkans countries that the Williams Institute is involved in.
Fantastic.
In Tanzania, at least 7 schools require HIV-positive students to wear red ribbons to protect them, to identify them as HIV positive.
Well, Bill Buckley wanted to tattoo everybody on their butts.
5% of the population of Tanzania is HIV positive.
Scary.
And a Russian judge has upheld the decision of the Russian Olympic Committee to not have an LGBT pride house at the 2014 Olympic Games.
Unbelievable. There will be one in London this year.
She said,
pride house.
She said it's against social morality and breaches our understanding of good and evil. And the IOC is not commenting.
Not commenting.
Yeah.
I was going to say they should pull out.
All right. AIDS news. The
President of the United States, that's Barack Obama, has appointed Grant Colfax, doctor, to be the director of the Office of National AIDS Policy. He was the director of the HIV prevention section at the San Francisco Department of Public Health, and even Petrellis
says he's okay.
Says he's okay.
I was waiting to hear from him. All right. Entertainment news. Gillian Anderson interviewed in the new issue of Out magazine. You remember her from the X-Files and what was the Edith Wharton movie?
Help us out.
She's going to be in the upcoming BBC series Great Expectations on PBS's Masterpiece. I've been with a few women, she says. Well, since everyone I know thinks she's just a full-time lesbian, Yeah, although she is married with kids now, but
to a man.
Yeah, she's going to play Miss Havisham in Great Expectations. She's 44 years old.
Wow.
She says, well, it's a different point of view.
There's a big lesbian and LGBT book fair coming up in New York on March 24th. It's Saturday, right? Yep. Yeah. At the LGBT Community Center in New York from 11 to 5:30. It's called the 4th Annual Rainbow Fair. You just go to rainbowbookfair.org for that.
Think we have time for the Bully trailer?
Why not?
Bully, a new movie about to be released, is their huge campaign to get the rating changed from R to PG-13. Can we take a look at the trailer?
The last couple of days, we had heard that Tyler had his head shoved into a wall locker. They said he is a geek.
My concern is that you were making someone feel so uncomfortable that they didn't want to be in school.
I feel kind of nervous going to school because I like learning, but I have trouble with making friends.
They said he is a geek. Some kids had told him that he is worthless, to go hang himself. And I think he got to the point to where enough was enough.
Tonight, a tragic situation.
A Perkins boy, just 11 years old, believed to have been desperate enough to take his own life.
This is an awfully complicated and difficult issue.
Kids will be kids, boys will be boys. They're just cruel at this age.
Here what we get is nothing's wrong, we didn't do anything, everything's fine.
They punch me, strangle me, take things from me, sit on me.
Give it to him hard! He's not safe on that bus.
I've been on that bus. They are just as good as gold.
My voice is not going to fall silent. I will go to my grave until a difference is made.
We reached out to parents that have lost kids, parents of kids that are being bullied all over the world, and it took off like wildfire.
All it takes is for one person to stand up.
Be the difference. Go out and find that one child, that new kid standing over there by himself. Be willing to stand up for him.
Everything starts with one and builds up. Eventually we have an army.
If we all do it together, we will change the world.
This should be PG, not PG-13. It should be required viewing for every kid in elementary school.
Everybody should stand up against bullies. We need more of that and less of this stand your ground laws that killed that poor kid in Florida.
But one thing that is getting seen a lot is this video of a lesbian couple at a hockey game in Canada, at a Maple Leafs game, where one proposed to the other. If you Google lesbian hockey proposal, you'll see this absolutely fabulous video. We'd show it, but it's all you really hear is a music bed over it. So
we'll put it in our email if you send it to me. Write to me, Andy Hum at AOL. We send out a weekly email, and I'll include it this week.
And congratulations to Omar Sharif Jr., grandson of Omar Sharif. He has come out as gay and half Jewish.
I was certainly rooting for Omar to come out years ago.
Well, now you have the grandson. We will see you next week.
Bye-bye.